and ICM in poker, tournament poker is already so complicated enough. For me, it's value betting, solid preflop ranges, and ICM. Like I would just rinse and repeat those three things in tournament poker. What about you? What do you think are the most important concepts to study? Maybe cash game versus tournaments, if you would.
Part of your approach sounds somewhat similar to mine, except it looks like you found like different spots, and mine was more like based on intuition over like seeing lots of things over and over and over again.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, it did have. It sounded like yours was based off a lot of your own database. You actually have a massive database. You're playing 75,000 sit and goes. Like you, like, uh, and yeah. So like, there's this idea of mass data analysis, but apparently you already have the mass data from all the hands you've played, so you can just look in your database
yeah,
and see how people have played, which is
yeah,
interesting. I mean, that sounds like what you've done, right? Or am
yeah.
I missing something?
A lot of it is also from studying with others, and it's like even it's not just the sit and go tournaments where I've accumulated a lot of experience and I know how people play short stack, and
Hmm.
you might say, oh, but the game has changed. Or, yeah, the game has changed, but then the other aspect of the game is you make your money against bad players, and bad players don't really like someone that learns the game today, or they're not really learning the game, they just want to play, and they're still the human beings as they were 10 years ago. And I see it when I'm a heads up in a tournament. It's people still react to certain strategies, right? So if you raise the limb 2 times in a row, you should probably not do it the third time as a bluff. We are human beings and we can be quite emotional. And when it's man against man or man against woman, it's like it's a battle. And I feel like in these days, people neglect that aspect of the game a lot. That you adjust. Like even if the sample size is super low, it feels like 3 times in a row you're three betting me. No, no way, And then you start making dumb shit. Yeah, yeah, and just this component of the game that there's still so much psychology involved. Something we also did, for example, is all of these solvers, right, are based on chippy strategies. So they have ICM section, but if you look at the post flop simulation and output, it's built on chippy. But in tournament poker, the ranges alter already like when only 25% of the field are busted. So if we take a preflop spot and we consider the payout structure and everything, and we solve it, we get different preflop ranges as in cash game. Some people might say, but you're so far away from the bubble. Well, but it's still different because you have a tournament structure. You're out of the tournament. Even if you have a re-entry, your buy-in is gone. And this is what a lot of people don't understand, that now the studying you do for post flop, you actually get a lot of very inaccurate results because technically the preflop ranges look different. And you probably know this from your own studying. If you have a preflop range and then if you, let's say, the famous spot is if you have the guy raise under the gun, the board comes king jack 9, and you just removed from the big blind the queen 10 combos, you get a completely different strategy. And now the same is that with ICM adjusted ranges versus normal chippy ranges, the ranges look completely different for 3-bet pots, for single raise pots, and you don't really get accurate results. And this is what a lot of people don't pay attention to. And I don't even get me started that most people have up flop strategies, they're not check raising enough or too much. And then if you carry it on the Channel River, you get completely different outputs. So I like your approach a lot, what you mentioned earlier about trying to play a game based on your observations, right? Based on your experience. Like what are people actually doing and what can I do to have a solid game plan against that and make good exploits. And if I feel like it's a spot where for example, 4-bet pots. I don't remember the last time when someone 4-bet me and then ran a triple barrel bluff, even though you're supposed to bluff quite a bit because you have a pretty strong range. So you can bluff
Yeah.
a lot,
Matter of
right? And
fact, I tell my students that a lot is that basically no one plays four-bet pots right. Is
yeah,
it's
yeah,
I mean there's some bluffs in those spots, but really depends on who. It's certain special snowflakes.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
They all don't play quite the same, but yeah, forward pots. The machine says something wildly different from what happens.
That's why I'm also telling my students when they just rip in the ace king off for 100 big blinds as a 5-bet, just call. You don't eliminate the bluffs. If they give you a lot of action, like 90% of the time they have it, or they're jacks or tens. You don't need to make these protection jams, and even if it's out of position, like seriously, think about when was the last time you slow played aces and the guy 4-bet barreled ace queen off or three barreled ace queen off or ace five suited into you. Right? It's just not happening, especially in advanced stage of the tournament. So what does it mean? Your equity utilization goes through the roof. You always get to see all 5 cards, almost always. And poker can be so sensitive. We just change a few variables. It alters our strategy completely. And a lot of the spots, the strategies are completely different. So it means we can do crazy things in poker. And that's what we like to do, is to based on data, but also based on experience. Just like I think 99% of the poker players would agree with playing 4-bet pots or experience in 4-bet pots. So yeah, that's what I mean with keep poker simple. It's not that difficult.
Um, a big thing that so one thing is that I still think it helps a ton to study these solutions at these different ICM stages and whatever. I
Yeah.
think it becomes really complicated just because, like you said, like everyone's playing like different strategies and not really, playing exactly GTO anyway. I personally I do some things to really simplify the problems a lot, where I find people have like gaping holes in their strategies, and like kind of just punish unless they happen to fill those holes in like a reasonable way. An example would be one thing that one abstraction I've noticed is that people over c bet a lot in 3-bet pots a ton. It's not really supposed to happen that much, but and the way they respond to delay c bets, etc., can be like really predictable overall. Whereas it's not something that if you were to like construct the 3-barrel ranges, with the different ICMs structures and tournaments, you might like it's probably pretty easy to that up and or not really gain that much EV. But if you do certain things like take them to a node that they're not really used to, that where they like pigeonhole their strategies by like just betting when they have something and checking when they don't, kind of thing, then you can make people make really big mistakes unless they just like decide to do something that is almost impossible to decide to do, like hero call, like what you're saying, like a third pair combo when they're supposed to do it, but it's just like an almost impossible decision to make.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And with the oversea betting, it's in tournaments actually good because people are not check raising enough.
Yeah, that is something
So
I noticed too.
you just see bet everything. It's like there's some maniacs out there who of course adjust, but the majority don't. And from that little live poker experience I had, I still felt like raising is so I mean, don't get started on turn raises, but flop check raising, it's just like just see bet everything, and you'll be fine. Maybe you lose a little bit EV, but it's just not worth your time to go so deep down the rabbit hole to make such a small increase in EV or RI or whatever win rate metric we're using. So, and ICM in poker, tournament poker is already so complicated enough. For me, it's value betting, solid preflop ranges, and ICM. Like I would just rinse and repeat those 3 things in tournament poker. What about you? What do you think are the most important concepts to study? Maybe cash game versus tournaments, if you would compare it. I'm very curious your take on that.
One thing that I think would be not really focused enough on in tournaments is something like the psychology of situations,
Oh yeah, that's
which
huge. Yeah.
we touched on this like a little bit, but it's going to be really difficult for someone who's under like an extreme amount of pressure to play GTO at a final table, and like
Yeah.
especially if they just recently made a huge mistake or they lost a ton of their chips.
Yeah.
And the opposite can kind of happen where they're on a positive run, and certain people will lock it up, and certain people will play insane, and that I would think matters a ton, specifically in tournaments where you don't, throw theory out the window, basically, or not out the window, but you can adjust in some crazy ways if
You kind of
people
do,
have,
yeah, yeah.
and at least like these, it's going to be really prevalent in these where people are not mentally disciplined,
Hmm.
like these lower stakes tournaments and things like that, where people do stupid things.
Yeah.
Um, in cash games, honestly, like the fundamentals really matter a lot. Mine are not perfect, but in these limit games and stuff like that, I just don't see how the anyone's going to make up for the fact of playing like shit preflop. That seems that like if you get the preflop right, these shallow stack sizes, or limit games, that's just a huge thing. It's as stupid as it is, and then in these other cash game things, there probably are like loads of exploits. Like it goes in the opposite direction where I would refer to something like MDA, where there's just loads of exploits that you can use in. Oh, there's another thing that I thought was really important, but there's loads of exploits that you can use to gain some EV, especially if like no one really knows what you're doing. A major concept that I realized is very important in tournaments, but not exactly cash games, was that so in cash games there's this idea where you have GTO and you have your bluffs to GTO or whatever from your range advantage, etc. And you don't really care how much EV these bluffs generate, rather that they're at least neutral EV or plus EV based on the situation, your range advantage, and whatever. Now in tournaments that's not true. So in tournaments, if a bluff is neutral EV and your chips are worth something, that bluff becomes minus EV. And however, there are a bunch of population exploits and all kinds of exploits that can still be used for plus EV type bluffs that are really worth looking into and thinking about in the context of okay, is this bluff plus EV? Is how plus EV is it? Can I do this with this kind of stack size, etc.? And if you were to like appropriately gauge these sorts of variables, then you could create an exploitative strategy that takes into account the ICM considerations based off of like certain opponents you're playing as and the sort of the stack sizes you're playing with. But it wouldn't be that easy to do, and you'd have to estimate quite a bit. But with deep knowledge of whatever exploits work based on your database, it's definitely possible. And this, the, I personally divided the bluffs into three different categories. Another type of bluff, this would be like the kind of bluff that can be exploitative, where you can also get exploited. But there's the one that you can where you have the range advantage and it gives you an edge or whatever. Like you'd have to think in terms of that as well, like how many bluffs you can add or subtract based on where you are in your ICM situation in the tournament. So, but ICM like tends to take that into account a lot more directly. So that seems to be a really relevant concept. Population exploits in general in cash games, but also how it applies to tournaments and your stack sizes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I mean, with ICM, like honestly, I think now for final tables,
Hmm.
just speaking about final tables because you mentioned it earlier that you throw strategy out of the window or theory out of the window, but you kind of right. We're also next to our course because we also have the training software where what I was doing, and we don't try to build the next solver. What we're trying to do is to provide realistic scenarios that people can practice. And we have a couple of scenarios where we just removed someone instead of supposed to be three betting 7% as a mid stack, only he three bets only 5 or 6%. You
Hmm.
suddenly your range doesn't go from you defend instead of 50, you defend 40%, you start defending only 20%. It gets absolutely ridiculous. And that's where people make a lot of mistakes. And you know how we say that a final table always amplifies your character. So if you're by nature like a more aggressive, you want to win, you tend to also, from time to time to punt it off and you play a lot more aggressive, you want to play for the win. But also same goes in the other direction. A lot of players who by nature might be a little bit less risky and trying to ladder, playing more careful, they're also the ones who are not going to be 3-betting your light, and they're not going to find those GTO 3-bets, those blocker plays. And if you remove those, we have discovered scenarios where you make crazy folds. Like, it's absolutely insane. Folds where a lot of players would say, oh, this is standard, right? You get it in with queens, but even if the guy has a few bluffs, you're still folding. And the same goes for chip leaders or big stacks that are just 3-betting 17% instead of 15%. And they continue with the same 5-bet all-ins against your 4-bet. Your range goes from, let's say, folding 70% of the time, and then you go all in with your pocket tens, ace queen plus, and then you mix in some ace 5 suited, king queen suited, because they're also powerful because they're bluffing so much. You start non and 4-betting your entire range. Like, you 4-bet fold 7-6 suited. Right? It's just like a small change in your opponent's strategy goes into you actually supposed to 4-bet range. And it's super great to see, and I think we're in a stage now where you get to see so many final table plays where a lot of players are going to be like, what the f*** is this guy doing? But it's actually the right thing to do.